When a corrupt judge tried to belittle Sarah Mitchell in his courtroom, he had no idea what was about to unfold. Sitting quietly with her worn leather briefcase clutched tightly against her navy suit, she seemed like an easy target. But when he pushed too far, her unexpected legal brilliance left the entire courthouse speechless. Sarah Mitchell smoothed her crisp white blouse and adjusted her glasses as she walked through the imposing courthouse doors. Most attorneys arrived in groups, chatting confidently with colleagues. But Sarah preferred to work alone. She had earned her law degree nearly 15 years ago, but rarely took center stage in high-profile cases. Today was different. She was representing Eleanor Davis, a 72-year-old widow fighting to keep her family home from being seized through what Sarah suspected was a fraudulent foreclosure. The opposing side was represented by Blackwell and Partners, one of the most powerful firms with connections throughout the judicial system. "Are you certain you're prepared for this?" asked Thomas Reed, her colleague who'd met her at the courthouse entrance. His weathered face showed genuine concern. Sarah nodded firmly. "Someone has to stand up for Mrs. Davis. She'll lose everything if we don't." "Just watch yourself in there," Thomas warned. Judge Harrison has quite the reputation. They don't call him the Hammer for nothing. Sarah had done her research meticulously. Judge Robert Harrison had been on the bench for over 20 years and was known for his harsh rulings, particularly against defendants challenging large financial institutions. What wasn't as widely known were his financial ties to several banks, including the one currently trying to take Mrs. Davis's home. "I'm prepared," she replied simply, her voice betraying none of the anxiety she felt. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, imposing in their mahogany grandeur. Sarah took a deep breath and gripped her worn leather briefcase tighter. Inside was everything she needed: meticulously prepared documentation, precedents, and evidence that had taken months to gather. "Don't let him intimidate you," Thomas said. "That's his favorite tactic." "I won't," Sarah promised. As they entered the courtroom, Sarah felt eyes tracking her movements. She recognized several attorneys from Blackwell and Partners. Their tailored suits and confident smirks were designed to intimidate. Their lead counsel, Edward Blackwell himself, was present, unusual for what should have been a routine foreclosure case. "They've brought out the big guns," Thomas whispered. "Why would Blackwell himself show up for this?" "Because something isn't right with this case," Sarah replied softly. "And they know I know it." Mrs. Davis was already seated at the defendant's table, her weathered hands trembling slightly. Sarah gave her a reassuring smile as she sat down beside her. "Everything will be all right," she told Mrs. Davis, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Robert Harrison." Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His black robe seemed more regal than those of his peers, and his piercing eyes scanned the room like searchlights. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice resonating through the chamber. Sarah observed him carefully. 65 years old, connected to the city's elite, and rumored to be considering a political run after retirement. Judge Harrison wasn't just any judge. He was an institution. First case: Atlantic Banking Corporation versus Eleanor Davis, foreclosure proceeding, the clerk announced. Judge Harrison's eyes locked onto Sarah, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had clearly expected the Davis case to be handled by one of the senior partners at her firm. "Counsel, identify yourselves for the record," he instructed. Edward Blackwell stood, his voice smooth and practiced. "Edward Blackwell of Blackwell and Partners, representing Atlantic Banking Corporation, Your Honor." Sarah rose next. "Sarah Mitchell, representing Mrs. Eleanor Davis, Your Honor." "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, drawing out her name. "I don't believe I've seen you in my courtroom before. I typically handle cases in the Eastern District, Your Honor," Sarah responded politely. The judge nodded, a thin smile appearing. "Well, I trust you'll find our proceedings straightforward. Mr. Blackwell, you may begin." Blackwell launched into his opening statement with the confidence of someone who'd already won. The bank's case seemed airtight. Missed payments, proper notification procedures, standard foreclosure protocols. Sarah listened quietly, taking occasional notes. To an observer, she might have seemed overwhelmed by Blackwell's polished delivery. In reality, she was picking apart every claim, identifying the discrepancies she'd spent months documenting. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," Judge Harrison said when the attorney finished. His tone was notably warmer than when addressing Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, your opening statement." Sarah stood, briefcase in hand. "Your Honor, we contend that this foreclosure is fundamentally fraudulent. Mrs. Davis's payment history shows no delinquency until the bank's computer system was upgraded last year. We have documentation proving all payments were made on time." Judge Harrison's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, counsel." "We have the evidence to support it, Your Honor." "I'm sure you believe you do," the judge replied, his condescension barely concealed. "Proceed with your evidence presentation, but I advise you to be very certain before alleging fraud against a respected financial institution." Sarah nodded, unfazed. "I'm quite certain, Your Honor." Sarah presented her case methodically, laying out evidence of Mrs. Davis's consistent payment history. Bank statements, receipts, and electronic transfer records formed a clear pattern until 8 months ago, when the bank system suddenly showed 3 missed payments. "As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Davis's automatic payments continued to be withdrawn from her account," Sarah explained, displaying the bank statements. "Yet somehow, they weren't credited to her mortgage." Judge Harrison looked bored. "Computer errors happen, counsel. That hardly constitutes fraud. If it were just a computer error, the situation would have been corrected when Mrs. Davis brought it to the bank's attention," Sarah continued. "Instead, they added late fees, refused to acknowledge the payments she could prove she made, and fast-tracked the foreclosure despite her 40 years of perfect payment history." Edward Blackwell stood. "Your Honor, while Ms. Mitchell's storytelling is entertaining, the facts remain clear. Our records show the payments when received. Perhaps Mrs. Davis's evidence is the result of her own record-keeping errors." Sarah noticed Judge Harrison nodding slightly at Blackwell's argument. Furthermore, Blackwell continued, "Given Mrs. Davis's age and the documented early signs of cognitive decline in her medical records." "Objection," Sarah interrupted. "Mrs. Davis's medical records aren't relevant to this proceeding and weren't subpoenaed or submitted as evidence." The courtroom fell silent. How did Blackwell have Mrs. Davis's medical information? Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwell, explain how you came to possess the defendant's medical information." Blackwell hesitated. "General discovery, Your Honor." "No medical records were requested or provided during discovery," Sarah stated firmly. "This represents a serious privacy violation and further suggests coordination between the plaintiff and external parties to build a false case against my client." The judge's expression darkened. "Ms. Mitchell, that's an extraordinary claim. Are you suggesting impropriety by opposing counsel?" "I'm stating facts, Your Honor. Facts that form a disturbing pattern." Judge Harrison's jaw tightened. "Watch yourself, counsel. Unfounded accusations in my courtroom can result in sanctions." Sarah remained composed. "I understand, Your Honor." "Good," the judge replied. "Because I'm not impressed by dramatic performances from inexperienced attorneys. Stick to provable facts." Several spectators in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at the judge's tone. Sarah felt Mrs. Davis's hand tremble beside her. "Your Honor," Sarah said quietly, "may I approach the bench with Mr. Blackwell?" The judge waved them forward. As Sarah gathered her briefcase and walked to the bench, she could feel the tension in the courtroom rising. This was the moment everything would change. "Your Honor," Sarah began once she and Blackwell stood before the bench, "I believe we need to address several procedural issues before continuing." "What issues?" Judge Harrison asked impatiently. "First, the unauthorized access of my client's medical records. Second, the unusual speed with which this foreclosure was processed." The judge cut her off. "Ms. Mitchell, foreclosures follow standard timelines. Not when they skip mandatory mediation steps and cooling-off periods," Sarah replied evenly. "This case bypassed 3 required procedural stages." Blackwell interjected smoothly. "Your Honor, given the clear evidence of default, the bank exercised its right to expedite proceedings under Section 4.3 of the mortgage agreement." Judge Harrison nodded. "That seems reasonable." Section 4.3 only applies in cases of intentional default or fraud by the borrower, Sarah countered. "Neither condition exists here, making the expedited process improper." The judge's expression hardened. "Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Blackwell has far more experience with banking regulations than you appear to have. I'm inclined to accept his interpretation." Sarah remained silent, and the judge seemed to take her silence as defeat. His lips curled into a slight smirk as he addressed the courtroom. "Let's return to open court," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "Perhaps Ms. Mitchell can present actual evidence, rather than procedural complaints." Back at their respective tables, Judge Harrison continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Ms. Mitchell, in my courtroom, we value efficiency and expertise. Do you have any substantive arguments to present, or should we conclude this matter?" The courtroom had gone completely silent. All eyes were on Sarah, who sat quietly reviewing her notes. Her perceived hesitation encouraged the judge further. "Mrs. Davis deserves competent representation," Harrison continued, addressing the courtroom as if giving a lecture. "Foreclosure cases require a thorough understanding of banking law. Perhaps a more experienced attorney from your firm should have handled this matter." A few attorneys from Blackwell's team exchanged smirks. Edward Blackwell himself maintained a professional demeanor, but his eyes revealed satisfaction at the judge's treatment of his opponent. Sarah finally stood, her expression unchanged. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter several documents into evidence." "Proceed," Harrison sighed theatrically. "First, Exhibit A. Mrs. Davis's complete payment history, certified by 2 independent auditors." Sarah handed the documents to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. Harrison glanced at them dismissively. "Second, Exhibit B. Internal communications from Atlantic Banking Corporation, discussing what they call Operation Harvest, a program targeting properties in appreciating neighborhoods owned by elderly individuals with significant equity." The judge's head snapped up. "What is this?" "Communications obtained legally through a whistleblower, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. And finally, Exhibit C. Financial disclosures showing property investments made through shell companies partially owned by several prominent individuals. Judge Harrison's face flushed. "What exactly are you implying, counsel?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "I'm not implying anything, Your Honor. The documents speak for themselves." A tense silence blanketed the courtroom. Judge Harrison stared at Sarah, his previous condescension replaced by something darker. "Ms. Mitchell," he said through clenched teeth, "approach the bench. Mr. Blackwell, you too." As Sarah gathered her documents, Mrs. Davis whispered, "Is everything all right?" "Yes," Sarah assured her. "Just stay calm." At the bench, Judge Harrison's voice was low and threatening. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "Presenting relevant evidence in my client's case, Your Honor," Sarah replied evenly. "These allegations are preposterous," Blackwell interjected. "This so-called Operation Harvest document is likely fabricated. And these financial records, even if authentic, have no bearing on Mrs. Davis's defaulted mortgage." The judge nodded. I agree. Ms. Mitchell, I'm excluding these documents as irrelevant and potentially defamatory. Sarah had anticipated this. Your Honor, respectfully, you cannot exclude these documents. Harrison's eyes widened. Excuse me. Federal Rules of Evidence 401 and 402 clearly establish that evidence having any tendency to make a fact more or less probable is relevant and admissible, unless specifically excluded by the Constitution, federal statutes, or other rules. Unaware of the federal rules, counsel, the judge snapped. I determine relevance in my courtroom. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah continued calmly. However, in Thomason v. Hensley, the Supreme Court established that evidence suggesting systematic targeting of vulnerable homeowners is always relevant in contested foreclosure cases. Blackwell frowned. I'm not familiar with that case. 2018, Your Honor. Justice Kagan wrote the majority opinion. Judge Harrison's face betrayed his own uncertainty, which quickly turned to anger. Ms. Mitchell, if you're deliberately misrepresenting precedent. I would never do that, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted, reaching into her briefcase. I have the relevant excerpt here. She handed the printout to the judge, who scanned it with increasing discomfort. Returning to the table, Sarah addressed the court. Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness, Michael Turner, former data analyst at Atlantic Banking Corporation, and the whistleblower who provided the Operation Harvest documents. A man in his 30s stood up from the spectator section and walked toward the witness stand. Objection. Blackwell nearly shouted. We received no witness list from opposing counsel. Sarah turned to him. Actually, Mr. Blackwell, I submitted my complete witness list 3 weeks ago. I have the certified mail receipt and the court clerk's acknowledgement. Mr. Turner was listed as witness number 3. The clerk nervously confirmed this. She's correct, Your Honor. The witness list was properly filed. Judge Harrison's composure was visibly cracking. He turned to Blackwell. Did you receive this witness list? Blackwell hesitated. I would need to check with my team. Sarah spoke up. Perhaps Mr. Blackwell was too busy accessing my client's private medical records to review properly submitted discovery materials. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for silence, his face reddening. Your Honor, Sarah continued, before Mr. Turner testifies, I believe the court should be aware that the shell company mentioned in Exhibit C, Ridgeline Properties, lists among its beneficial owners a Robert Harrison. I'm curious if that's merely a coincidence. The judge froze, his gavel suspended in midair. The courtroom collectively held its breath. These proceedings will be in recess for 15 minutes, he finally announced, his voice strained. Counsel for both parties in my chambers now. Judge Harrison's chambers were opulently decorated with leather-bound law books, awards, and photographs of him with various political figures. The contrast between his hostile expression and the smiling faces in those photographs was stark. This is outrageous, he began once the door closed. Ms. Mitchell, you're walking a dangerous line with these unfounded insinuations. Sarah remained calm. With respect, Your Honor, nothing I've presented is unfounded. The documentation is extensive and verified. Blackwell interjected. This is clearly a desperate attempt to distract from the simple facts of the case. Mrs. Davis missed payments. The bank has the right to foreclose. Sarah opened her briefcase again. If I may, I'd like to clarify several points. Without waiting for permission, she placed 3 documents on the judge's desk. First, the complete audit showing Mrs. Davis never missed a payment. Second, internal Atlantic Banking communications specifically identifying her property as a harvest target due to its location and her age. And third, property records showing that foreclosed homes from this program were consistently purchased at auction by Ridgeline Properties, often at 40% below market value. Judge Harrison didn't touch the documents. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Your Honor. I'm demonstrating a pattern. The bank falsifies payment records for targeted homeowners, expedites foreclosures bypassing normal consumer protections, and then a shell company purchases these properties at deflated prices. The shell company's investors, including yourself, then benefit from substantial returns when the properties are redeveloped or resold. Blackwell's face had gone pale. Your Honor, this is absurd. Is it? Sarah interrupted, pulling out another document. This is your firm's billing record for operational consulting, Project Harvest. Over the past 3 years, your firm has billed over $2 million for work on this specific program. The judge stood abruptly. That's enough. This case is being reassigned. I'll recuse myself due to Ms. Mitchell's outrageous accusations. Recusal would be appropriate, Sarah agreed. However, reassignment won't be necessary. What do you mean? The judge demanded. As we speak, the FBI is executing search warrants at Atlantic Banking Corporation, Blackwell and Partners, and Ridgeline Properties offices. They're also seizing the banking records Your Honor attempted to seal last month in the Martinez case. Both men stared at her in shocked silence. I've been working with federal prosecutors for 11 months, Sarah explained. Mrs. Davis's case isn't unique. It's one of 78 we've identified. I was specifically asked to handle this case because they needed someone the banking establishment wouldn't consider a threat. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face. You were building a case all along. Yes, Your Honor. Your financial entanglements with Atlantic Banking and Ridgeline made you a person of interest early in the investigation. Your treatment of me today was predictable. A knock at the door interrupted them. 2 men in suits entered, showing FBI credentials. Judge Robert Harrison, one said formally, we need you to come with us to answer some questions. Blackwell stood shakily. I need to call my attorney. That would be advisable, Sarah noted. Though you might want to find representation outside your firm. As the FBI agents escorted the judge out, he turned to Sarah. You played us. Sarah shook her head. No, Your Honor. You played yourself. I just followed the evidence. When Sarah returned to the courtroom alone, confused murmurs filled the air. The bailiff looked uncertain without the judge present. Mrs. Davis clutched her purse anxiously. What's happening? She whispered as Sarah sat beside her. Justice, Mrs. Davis, Sarah replied softly. Finally, justice. The courtroom doors opened again as 2 FBI agents escorted Judge Harrison out, followed by additional agents leading a visibly shaken Edward Blackwell. The spectators erupted in shocked conversations. The court clerk, looking bewildered, approached Sarah. Ms. Mitchell, what should we do about today's proceedings? I believe Judge Ramirez from the 4th Circuit is available to take over, Sarah suggested. I've already spoken with the administrative office about the situation. As if on cue, Judge Sophia Ramirez entered through a side door. In her 60s, with a reputation for fierce independence and ethical standards, she surveyed the chaotic scene with practiced calm. Court will come to order, she announced, her authoritative voice immediately quieting the room. I've been briefed on the extraordinary circumstances here. This court will recess until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, at which point we will restart these proceedings properly. As people began to exit, reporters who had somehow caught wind of the situation crowded the hallway outside. Sarah guided Mrs. Davis through a side exit to avoid the commotion. I don't understand everything that happened, Mrs. Davis said once they were in a quiet consultation room. But I know you saved my home. Sarah smiled. It was never just about your home, Mrs. Davis. This scheme has hurt dozens of families. The evidence we gathered will help all of them. Thomas burst into the room, his eyes wide. Sarah, it's all over the courthouse. Harrison and Blackwell taken out by the FBI. What did you do? My job, she replied simply. But how? When? I mean, he stammered. I've been working with federal prosecutors since last year, Sarah explained. After I noticed the pattern in foreclosure cases, I took my concerns to them. They were already investigating the bank for other irregularities. Thomas shook his head in amazement. All those times I worried you weren't experienced enough for these cases. That perception was useful, Sarah noted. Being underestimated gave me access no one else could have had. Mrs. Davis took Sarah's hand. You're not what you seem, are you? Sarah squeezed the elderly woman's hand gently. None of us are, Mrs. Davis. That's the lesson here. 1 month later, Sarah sat in her modest office reviewing case files. The aftermath of what the press had dubbed the Harvest scandal continued to unfold across front pages nationwide. Judge Harrison had resigned from the bench and was now facing federal charges for corruption, fraud, and racketeering. Edward Blackwell and 3 other partners at his firm had been indicted. Atlantic Banking Corporation stock had plummeted, and class action lawsuits were mounting. A knock at her door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Thomas entered, carrying a newspaper. Still making headlines, he remarked, tossing the paper on her desk. The front page story detailed how federal investigators had expanded their probe to 5 other states where similar foreclosure schemes had been identified. The justice system works slowly, but it does work, Sarah replied. Thomas took a seat across from her. The partners want to talk about making you head of the new consumer protection division they're creating. Your name has become quite the asset. Sarah smiled slightly. I'm not interested in being anyone's asset. Then what are you interested in? Before she could answer, her phone rang. She checked the caller ID. U.S. Attorney's Office. I need to take this, she said. Thomas nodded and left as Sarah answered. After a brief conversation, she hung up and gazed out her window at the city skyline. The U.S. Attorney had just offered her a position in their office, leading a new task force on financial crimes against vulnerable populations. It was meaningful work that would allow her to help more people like Mrs. Davis. The computer chimed with an email notification. It was from Mrs. Davis, with photos attached of her grandchildren visiting her at the home she had almost lost. The subject line read simply, "Thank you for fighting when no one else would." That evening, as Sarah cleared out her office having accepted the U.S. Attorney's offer, she reflected on the events that had led her here. Judge Harrison had seen a quiet woman he thought he could intimidate. He never suspected she had quietly built a case that would bring down an entire corrupt network. As she placed her law degree in a box, Sarah recalled the judge's words in his chambers. You played us. She hadn't corrected him then, but the truth was simpler. She had merely been patient, thorough, and unbending in her pursuit of justice. The corruption had exposed itself once someone was willing to look closely enough. Sarah turned off the lights in her office for the final time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she was ready for them. Quietly, methodically, brilliantly. Life teaches us that appearances can be deceiving, and judgment often clouds the truth. Has someone underestimated you only to be surprised by your capabilities? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about a time when you proved someone wrong through your actions rather than words. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and unexpected brilliance, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us all why we should never judge a book by its cover. Where are you watching from today? Let us know.